Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Dungeons of Dredmor for PC, Mac, and Linux. This review is coming to you courtesy of Royale Beast. He gave me the humble intro version bundle, which eventually included Dungeons of Dredmor. So, thanks for that, dude. It's greatly appreciated. This is an indie roguelike developed by Gaslamp Games and released on July 13th of 2011. It was eventually included in the humble intro version bundle, but until then it was getting pretty good reviews actually, which is kind of surprising for a roguelike considering those really haven't changed at all since the 80s, and most of them are freeware, which this is not. So, the question is, what justifies this game having a price tag on it, and what sets it apart from other roguelikes which haven't changed since the 80s? Well, to start with, it certainly doesn't look like any other roguelike out there. Simply because it doesn't use ASCII graphics. What I mean by that is, if you look on YouTube and see those comments where people post and it looks like the Picard facepalm or something like that, then that's ASCII graphics. It's using characters from your random typing that you do to create images. And that's the kind of graphics that these older roguelikes tended to have. And even today they still have. They use stuff like a smiley face for your character, or a frowny face for the enemies, and all sorts of different little dots and lines and such to line out your dungeon. But this uses top-down 2D sprites and sorted animations for them. And it actually looks really nice, despite the fact that the sprites are clearly resized. What I mean by that is, this game, the lowest resolution is 1024 by 768, which is my monitor's native resolution. And so, when I'm playing this thing, and I'm noticing that everything looks kind of stretched, that's kind of a problem. Interface is actually pretty small, especially compared to everything else in the dungeon, and everything looks very pixelated and just odd compared to smaller res sprites that you can put into a smaller window. And I get the feeling that at some point they just decided to make the minimum resolution to be 1024 by 768 rather than say like 640 by 480 or 800 by 600 or something like that. And it just looks like the sprites have been resized. They look a little too pixelated to just be sprite art, but anyway. That's not a very big problem. It does actually come across very nice, and it's this very nice cartoony art style that really does convey the silliness of this game very well. And that's something I'll get to later on, but let's talk about the sound design, which is kind of a mixed bag. For one, the sound effects themselves that just do their job mostly, and that's it. They don't really need to do anything else, though. This is a roguelike. Most roguelikes don't even have sound effects, so they've already got to step up there. But most of the sound effects in this game actually do their job pretty well, and it ends up sounding fairly decent. The problem I have is that Diggles and Blobbies, in particular, have this ungodly annoying high-pitched squeal sound to them. And this just hurts my ears. I don't know about you guys if you've played Dungeons of Dredmor, but it really hurts my ears, especially if you just hear it constantly, because you're fighting a lot of Diggles and Blobbies. So, when you're plowing through all these enemies and you're just hearing high-pitched squeal after high-pitched squeal, it really just grates on my nerves after a while. But it's just one or two enemies that do that, and the rest of them sound okay. So it's not that big of a deal. But then there's the music, which is decent. It's not particularly amazing, and there's nothing really memorable about it, but it does its job. And the voice acting is just ridiculous. It's almost exclusively just telling you stuff like, eat food to regain health, or, you need more mana. And it sounds almost exactly like that, too. It's just this ridiculous, overacted, goofy-sounding voice, and it's meant to be that way. So, when you're playing through this and you'll just randomly hear this voice pop in whenever something triggers it, like the mana or the hit points or whatever, and you'll just be like, oh, really, game? Really? But still, it does contribute to that just goofy atmosphere. But then we come to the gameplay, because story is really not what matters in a roguelike. These are not story-driven games. The storyline for a roguelike is the setup, and that's kind of it. In this case, the setup is that the evil Lord Dredmor is up to no good, of course, and so the people need a hero. Unfortunately, they have you. So you go into a dungeon to defeat Lord Dredmor. That's pretty much it. He's the final boss of the game. You beat him, you win. Anyway, a roguelike is not centered around the story. It's centered around the gameplay, which is the fact that it's basically the ultimate dungeon crawler. These are games where you go around in a randomly generated dungeon after having picked your class and all that. And you're just running around this dungeon, killing monsters, disarming traps, finding all sorts of loot and all sorts of different things. And that's kind of it. That's what a roguelike is. And usually they last about 20 floors as well. They also have this feature called permadeath, which is where when your character dies, you can't load that character ever again. Even at a point before they died, no, you can't load that. That character is just gone. You have to start all over again. Which means that roguelikes in themselves are actually fairly hardcore. Dungeons of Dredmor isn't quite like that. It does have permadeath in it, but you can turn it off if you want. And it also has 3 different difficulty settings, whereas most roguelikes don't have difficulty settings at all. They're all just brutally difficult. In this particular case, Dungeons of Dredmor is the most accessible roguelike I've ever played. It explains things very well. It has a very user-friendly interface, mostly mouse-driven, whereas most roguelikes are keyboard, where you're moving around with arrow keys and doing different actions with the letter buttons. But Dungeons of Dredmor has that as well, but it's primarily a mouse-driven game, which is actually very nice because it makes it very easy to control. The interface itself is actually very nice. It's a little small, but it all flows very nicely. Everything has a nice little tooltip box that tells you what it is. And because it's turn-based and you don't have to worry about enemies just popping out of nowhere and suddenly starting attacking you while you're reading things, it's actually pretty easy to get used to. So this is an extremely accessible roguelike, and you can turn permadeath off, which is a big plus for me, because I hate that feature of roguelikes. Because what if I get to floor, say, 15 of the dungeon, and then suddenly die, and have to start all over again? That's just irritating. And in most cases, roguelikes all play and feel very much the same. Because they are. Dungeons of Dredmor does not. It is a very unique roguelike. Partly because it's hilarious. This game focuses almost entirely on its humor more than the gameplay itself, actually. Because to get a roguelike right, you don't really have to do much in terms of the gameplay. You have to make it a randomly generated dungeon. You have to make the game fairly difficult, if not brutally difficult, which Dungeons of Dredmor is the latter, by the way. Even on normal difficulty, it's brutally difficult. And you have to include a permadeath feature. And it has to be all about gathering loot and killing monsters and just dungeon crawling. And Dungeons of Dredmor does all of that. But it goes above and beyond the call. For one, like I said, it's hilarious. It focuses very heavily on its sense of humor, a lot of which is gaming related. You'll see things like just different references to nerd culture all the time. For instance, I was playing it recently, and a bat suddenly came up to me and yelled "Fuzro Da" as I whacked it in the face. So that was pretty amusing. But it's stuff like that that really makes this game just make you smile. You really can't go through this thing without at least chuckling at it. Because it's just completely silly. It doesn't take itself remotely seriously. In fact, you'll get achievements for dying, for instance. And you'll get a lot of achievements for dying, actually, because dying is very, very common in this game. You'll go along and you'll run into a huge room full of monsters, and it will just suddenly pop up and say, "Monster Zoo!" All sorts of crazy stuff. You regain mana by drinking booze. So you'll drink like Dwarven Rotgut and Grog and all sorts of different things. And you'll see different references to other games like Monkey Island or obviously Skyrim and stuff like that. Just all over the place. And of course they have their new DLC, which includes the new skill Emomancy. Yes, you have ridiculous skills as well, and you don't actually have a class system in this one. You select 7 skills among a very large plethora of them. Obviously you have the new one, Emomancy, but you also have stuff like you can make flesh golems, or standard stuff like swords and armor and stuff like that as well. But you can be a Viking or a psionic or Arithmancer with arithmetic-based magic, which is kind of interesting, and all sorts of different goofy stuff like that. And then you also have crafting skills. These are awesome. This game has a really in-depth crafting system. You find recipes as you go along all over the place. Really awesome system. Works really well, and it's actually got a lot you can craft. If it exists in this game, it can probably be crafted. And that does present a problem, however, because if you go like I do and get a bunch of crafting skills, then that means your inventory is going to be almost always full of crafting materials. Because if you're like me, you like to hoard things. And so, I would go through this dungeon, and I would have tons and tons and tons of crafting materials, and nothing that I could craft them with, because I didn't have appropriate recipes, or I didn't have a high enough skill level for it. So, that's a little bit annoying, and so inventory management is a little bit of a problem if you're like me, but if you're not like me, then you shouldn't have any trouble with it. And this game is brutally difficult. You will die a lot. Just already know that. But it's weird because when you die, it doesn't get frustrating really, unless of course you turn permadeath on because you're sadistic or something. Well, masochistic, I should say. But really, when you die, it's just part of the game. It's funny because usually you die to something really stupid. For instance, you'll die to a Diggle. They're the first enemies you fight, and they're ungodly pathetic. And if you die to one, it's just embarrassing. But it's just goofy stuff like that throughout the game. Anyway, ultimately, Dungeons of Dredmor is a really well-made roguelike, and it's also the most fun I've ever had with one. I normally hate roguelikes. I have a blast playing Dungeons of Dredmor. That should say something to you. So, if you haven't picked this up because you maybe don't like roguelikes, or maybe you just think that it's just another roguelike, I've got, NetHack or something, then you really should pick it up, because it is just a blast to play. It is the most fun I have ever had with a roguelike, and I really can't do anything but recommend it. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.